Good evening. I'm Marta Moreno Vega, uh, founder of Creative Justice Initiative and co-founder of Corredor Afro. We welcome you to this discussion, the activist vision and practice of Arturo Schomburg. In the process of putting this panel together, we found a lot of love for Arturo, right? Because many of us have framed our vision, our perspectives, our work around the concept of bringing together the African diaspora. And what does that mean and how does one do it? If we're doing research, how do we do research, right? From Afro diaspora perspective, as opposed to seeing things divided as disciplines apart from each other. And if anything, for me, in speaking for myself as a founder of institutions, reading Alfonso's letter to Nicolas Guillen, the poet laureate of Cuba, saying to Nicolas, my brother, Langston Hughes is going to Cuba, and I want to make sure that he sees the Afro-Cuban community. So I'm counting on you, my brother. So in one letter, no internet, no social media, he writes a letter that connects African America, the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, and forms a brotherhood, right? In terms of connecting our experiences. So that was the founding principle of the Caribbean Cultural Center, which I founded in New York, and continues to be the founding principle of how I see the world. So that in reading Giosana's essay, the inspiration of putting together this panel of saying, well, who else is thinking about Arturo Schomburg from a multidisciplinary flow connected network of knowing, right, and experiences. And when I read technologies, transculturalism, cultural culturalizations of race, gender, and ethnicity in Arturo Afonso's Masonic writings, light bulbs went out, and I had Yosana. So please meet Yosana Arroyo Martinez, who is the co-moderator of this panel. Josana?
Well, thank you very much, Marta. First of all, thank you for reaching out to me. Thank you for the Creative Justice Initiative and to Corredor Afro as well for sponsoring us here today. Um, how do I get to think about Arturo Schomburg and how he became so important to my research? This is the first question Marta requested from us to answer in this panel this evening. So I encountered Schomburg first as a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley. I read Eleanor DuVernay-Sinet's amazing biography of Schomburg that had also a lot of his works translated into Spanish first, right? Also, Flor Piñero de Rivera has another biography in Spanish that was kind of really important to the first introduction to Schomburg's life. As I moved to work on my second book on Freemasonry, this is where I delved into Schomburg's affiliations with Prince Hall Freemasonry in the United States. I had two Freemasons in my family, my great-grandfather and my grandfather. I had three, actually, and my uncle. So the three of them were interesting subjects, and Freemasonry was something that was kept a secret, something that some men in my family did, but that was kept private into their lives. Two of them were police officers, so they were Black police officers, which in any Latin American or colonial context, such as Puerto Rico, might be kind of a contradiction in many ways, right? They were exercising power and at the same time going into the lodge to these rituals, right? Delving into secrecy and kind of understanding their lives lives through as I ritual like what in African American, right, men, but also in the case of Schomburg. Um, and I understood, I defined in this book forms of knowledge. I mean, and this is what is really crucial and key about Schomburg's work. He was always delving into new knowledges, opening doors for others, particularly insisting on the importance of the Caribbean, of the Black experience in the Caribbean, but also the Black experience globally. And to me, this was really important um, as as a kind of transculturated figure as well, right? Someone who was coming from Puerto Rico, teaching in the United States, dealing with different languages, English and Spanish, kind of like looking into Latino communities and also African American communities here and finding similarities with them. So to me personally, but also to my students, Schomburg became a very important symbol. And as I moved from universities, first at the University of Michigan, and then here at the University of Texas, and where I became a professor, um, it became more and more central to study what Schomburg offer us, right? As transcultural scholars, but also as scholars who were minorities, thinking from and to different types of networks and rituals, but also understanding our places and our spirituality in this difficult society, right? Um, I I define in the book Schomburg's, in that article that Marta quotes, forms of double consciousness. In the case of Schomburg, and this is, of course, as many of you know, this is a contribution from W.E.B. Du Bois, the African American intellectual. And what I read and what I see is all these processes of double consciousness as kind of languages that are different and differ from each other, right? So your experience as a Black man is not the same as other experiences. Schomburg put that very clearly in his writings, right? Particularly The Negro Digs Up His Past, which I think is a foundational work, but also in a lot of his Masonic writings as well, which I also examine. For him, the figure of the artisan, the figure of the self-made man were kind of very important tropes in a lot of what he did and in his work. And I think the artisan as a trope, and we have two Freemasons here. We actually have three, because I think Evan said has also, or has been also initiated in the craft. They can explore this more further when they talk, but this notion of understanding uh, and submit, the notion of submission, but also the notion of silence, um, creates new forms of masculinity that are not necessarily linked to traditional ways of understanding power dynamics. I mean, and to me, that was kind of really uh, attractive, right? As a literary scholar, but also as a scholar who has been interested in the dynamics of gender, and not only in my family, but in Puerto Rican and Caribbean society. Um, so another important thing that I mentioned in my book that I think is important is, besides the transnational networks, racialization, is this notion of spiritual alchemy, right? And the fact that there's a connection of different forms of spirituality in the lodge, in the Masonic lodge, right? And these connections, I mean, they connect, particularly in Prince Hall lodges, with African-based forms of spirituality. Um, and here, particularly for the Caribbean, the figure of Ogun is kind of like really important, right? It's the Orisha of metal and the forge, right? It's the Orisha that advances civilization. And in many ways, I saw in many of Schomburg writings, particularly the ones dedicating to an artisan power, to artists, such as Jose Campeche, and to John Marant and his teachings and language. I mean, teachings for the Native Americans. This intention of understanding Blackness, and particularly Black people as agents of civilization, right? It's not uh, to see Blackness as a flaw, or kind of like associated it necessarily, as we always get, right, with the Middle Passage. And that was also part of his research as well, right? Africa was not completely ignored in his work. But this notions of education, pedagogy, and power were always embedded, right, in his writings, for understanding what the artisan, what the knowledge provider, the Black person brings into the world. So to me, that was really something that I look forward. I use the notion of subjugated freedoms, which is a notion that is very similar to what Nancy is going to talk about this later. She has explored suspect freedoms in the turn of the century and early 20th century Cuban migration. So I saw in many of Schomburg's work this affirmation of the letter, right, of the word as a dynamic of power, but at the same time, this uncomfortable like moments, right, of understanding knowledge as a site of a contested power, right? It's never a clean slate. Power and intellectual dynamics are not never ever, right, completely clean unless you come from a hegemony position. So Schomburg shows that you can have these negotiations of power, right, and affirm the word as a form of subjugated knowledge and open knowledge, right, from which the community, in this case, his Harlem community, that became a world community because it was in itself a global community, could benefit from. And I think this is what he still offers to students, to professors, and to people that enter his world. I mean, we're still discovering more and more of his biography, but also we're still reading with him and his experiences. Uh, what does the Caribbean world brings to the world, but also what the Black experience as a global experience brings into the world. So thank you. I will let.
Well, I think it's important. Also, the importance is that he introduces the notion of Africana studies, right? In one of his essays, that we're still fighting to achieve, right? In many departments, university departments, we
Well, and
see
his
the
library,
extent,
I mean,
right?
Africana Studies, and also he began the first program of Africana Studies at Fitz University. I mean, he went there, he purchased books, but he also was part of the process, right, of beginning this program. So we wouldn't have departments of Africana and African diaspora studies without Schomburg. I mean,
Exactly.
it's not only the library and the fact that he was a Freemason, and the fact that he traveled the world, is also the fact that he began what we are experiencing and living right now.
And trying to make sure that we hold on to as the move to
Oh,
cancel
yes.
culture
Yes,
is
we
a
know.
reality in the
Yes.
world. So as we move on to the panel, Nancy Mirabal, and we have, as Yosana mentioned, Masons on the panel, John and Jason and Alex and Ebenezer. And we also have the perspective of building institutions around that concept. You know, it's very important for us to see the intersectionality, the flow, right? And the lack of, and I always go back to Robert Farris Thompson, because he said, if you acquire a knowledge, you don't leave it. It always is embedded in you. So you bring that knowledge with whatever you're learning. And European or Eurocentric type of scholarship tries to divide it. You're either this or you're that, or you separate this from that. And I think what Schomburg teaches us is that it all is in the flow of knowledge, right? So, Dancy, would you join us?
Okay. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Marta and Josiana for the invitation. And Marta, I agree with you with Josiana's article. I too found it brilliant. And I was so inspired by it and I admired it so much that I had it reprinted in one of my edited volumes called Tecnofuturos. And I think that it's important that when we think about Schomburg, Josiana's article comes out in 2001. So it really is, as I just one of the few pieces at this time that I'm reading that allows for very complicated thinking about Schomburg. And it helped me as I was doing my work to think about knowledges, to think about even possibility, temporality, all of these points that Josiana brings up when we think about Schomburg, but also the Afro-diasporic community that comes to New York during the 19th century and the early 20th century. And so the book that I wrote, Suspect Freedoms, which Josiana mentions, was for me really a questioning. And it was a questioning because as a child of Cuban immigrants who come before the revolution, they were economic migrants, worked in New York City, had close relationships with Puerto Ricans. I was always told that this was a certain history, that we had a history that was 59 and beyond. But I knew there was a different history because it was a history of my family, my community. And that got me onto this journey of what other histories are being silenced and ignored and not part of the larger discussion. And Schomburg led me into that history because Schomburg, I think, shared that same passion, which is to tell a different story, right? To tell a different history, to center communities that are always silenced and ignored. And just reading Josiana's work tells me I now understand that comes from his own thinking around Freemasonry, around the understanding of secrecy and what secrets and secret societies, but also the importance of connection, of community, of empowerment, of seeing people as equals, of the importance of, and it felt like when I read Schomburg, that if you only know the history, if you were to know the experiences, you would think differently about a community and a history. So that really did get me to think deeper about this population. And so I ended up writing history, which took me close to 15 years to research and write, which begins in 1827 and ends in 1957. And what I learned is just these deep, deep histories of Black Cuban and Black Puerto Rican men who were already articulating notions of freedom, articulating notions of ending slavery, of a future nation, much earlier than the Jose Marti or any of these other leaders that we give so much credit to. Rafael Serra, as I argue, Marti says this. Why historians write differently, I don't know, but Marti makes it very clear that he learned from Rafael Serra, that it was through those conversations with Rafael Serra that he began to think differently about the role of race in not only the Cuban Revolutionary Party, but also in the future of Cuba and the future of Puerto Rico. And also Martin Moro Delgado, who's an Afro-Cuban leader who comes also in the 19th century, works with Rafael Serra, comes into these notions around politics and nation through the labor movement. And that's also another important piece of this history that we don't talk enough about. We say, oh, they're cigar workers, they work in the cigar factories, and that's true. In the 19th century, New York had more cigar factories than Key West or Tampa did. So there's a reason that the cigar workers go to New York. And they also create an industry around that cigar industry. But they're talking to each other and they are thinking about labor becomes so key. And I'd love to learn more about whether Freemasonry had any relationship to labor, because labor is an envisioning of what nation and what this community is going to look like as waged workers, right? It's always about the future of labor after slavery, during freedom. And so you cannot envision nation state without envisioning work and labor and power and hierarchy. And this is what Afro-Cuban and Afro-Puerto Rican men are already doing. And so in coming into this discussion, I was fascinating because I see, as much as Serra wrote about he was a journalist and he wrote and he organized in several clubs. What I would add is another thing is that Black Puerto Rican and Black men moved. They did not just go to New York. They were in Jamaica and Haiti and Venezuela, and they go into countries in Central America. Even in my own research, I was surprised that there were 5 different revolutionary clubs in Haiti alone. And so they're moving and they're organizing, and there has to be these circuits of knowledge that's not just revolutionary, but also Freemasonry. They must know other people in those countries that allow them those connections. They're able to have, these questions around politics. So I actually would love to learn more about, in my research kind of stopped, but I even found a New York Times article that mentioned the creation of these exile Puerto Rican and Cuban revolutionary communities as early as 1873. They were aware that there were these international organizations already taking place. And then I'll finish with the founding of the Cuban Anti-Slavery Society in New York in 1872, where it's African-American men who organize around the freedom for Cuba and, of course, later Puerto Rico. But it's a brilliant story in how African-American are envisioning freedom, the end of slavery, and Pan-Africanism from their own point of view, and how they see that in conjunction with what's happening in Cuba and later with Brazil. And the founders of that club were Henry Highland Garnett and Samuel Scotterin. And they also have their connections to Freemasonry among the African-American community. I don't know to what extent, but there seems to be a connection between African-American and Black Cuban, Black Puerto Rican kind of organizers that fall into these lines of Freemasonry. Again, it's really hard to do that research, but you see that Rafael Serra is also having conversations with many, African-American men in New York, outside of Cuba and the revolution. And they're envisioning kind of a larger, as Josiana mentioned, a larger set of knowledges and really remaking this world from their perspective. So I will leave it there. And
thank you so much, Nancy.
Yeah,
thank you. I think it's important also to envision that we come from ethnic groups that had societies,
yes,
right? That had community-based organizations, right? From Africa into the Americas. even before, you know, las sociedades en Cuba, las sociedades en Puerto Rico igual, y en Brazil igual. You know what I'm saying? So that we come with the knowledge of the importance of not only family, but organizing in society and what builds society and what builds community, right? Because we come from ethnic groups that had already city states.
Yes.
Right? So organization was part of that. And I think that that's left out of the history as we talk about ourselves. And that's why the importance of having this sort of intersectionality of different intelligences so that we can see differently and see the perspectives that are more ingrained in the cultural traditions and sacred practices that we bring, right? So
Yeah, I mean,
I think that the work still is in the becoming, right?
yes, what Nancy mentioned, I mean, which is key, right? The fact that anti-slavery became so important to all of these different ethnic groups, right? It was central to imagining a better world, right? It didn't matter if you were immigrationist or not. It didn't matter if the imagination was happening in different countries. I mean, many African Americans did not want to leave the United States. They wanted to stay in the United States. So this imagination of freedom, right, and what it means was discussed in the lodges, and it still is. I mean, I think this is what is so important, and as Nancy says, it's really hard to trace. It's a research that takes genealogy. It takes like a lot of different aspects of, and these books take. I mean, and her book took many years because a lot of this archival research takes a long time to unravel, but it's worth it. Yeah.
So can we go to the powerful Maricruz Clemente Rivera, or Rivera Clemente, I'm sorry, because I think that we need to get to what hands-on kind of out of the academy is, as well as bringing the academy to our communities in ways that understand that actually the academy is the community, because the process of getting information is basically people going to the community to extract or to gather or to inform themselves. So Maricruz Rivera Clemente.
Bueno, gracias por la invitación. A Marta, que me dijo sobre Schomburg, pero ella lo dice así como un panel y hablar de Schomburg. Y de verdad que pues rápido dije que sí, porque hay que seguir trabajando y dar a conocer, y más en nuestra isla, en Puerto Rico, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. La grandeza y las aportaciones de Schomburg, desafortunadamente, si la gente en Puerto Rico, la mayoría de las personas, podría yo decir, no conocen la figura de Schomburg, mucho menos conocen el legado y la aportación que ha hecho Schomburg, no solamente al Caribe, en Nueva York, sino al mundo. Y cuando yo escuché por primera vez de Schomburg, ya era yo una mujer adulta, hace como 20 años, en el 2002, dos compañeros antirracistas me dicen, Luis Raúl Romero y Juan de Mata, me están hablando en COPI, en nuestro centro, de la figura de Schomburg, y me dicen, pero aquí hay que hablar de Schomburg. Y yo no tenía idea de quién era Schomburg. Y entonces ahí comienzo a adentrarme en la vida de Arturo Alfonso Schomburg y ver su riqueza, su aportación y la necesidad urgente que tenía nuestra comunidad negra, afrodescendiente de Piñones, de entender a Schomburg para entendernos a nosotros mismos. Cuando comienzo a conocer a Schomburg, a enriquecerme con lo que me contaban de Schomburg, escuchando presentaciones de Benecer López Rullol, leyendo, conociendo, me doy cuenta que muchos puertorriqueños no sabían tampoco, no era solamente yo, muchos puertorriqueños tampoco sabían quién era Schomburg. Y ahí es donde comenzamos a hacer ese trabajo pragmático, a decir, bueno, la academia tiene cierta información de Schomburg, pero la gente de la comunidad, ¿cómo vamos a conocer? ¿Cómo vamos a saber si nadie nos habla? Si nadie nos pone en perspectiva a discutir y a diseminar lo que se está diciendo en otros sectores y en otros lugares. Así que comenzamos a hablarle a la gente de Schomburg, lo poquito que sabíamos, lo que íbamos aprendiendo, lo que íbamos desaprendiendo también, y empezamos a mover a la gente y mirarnos en esa relación. Y cuando, por ejemplo, Marta menciona, y ustedes han mencionado, que Schomburg comienza los estudios afro en las escuelas, en las universidades, a conversar sobre nuestras historias y nuestras aportaciones, lamentablemente en nuestro país todavía no existe esos proyectos universitarios, académicos, que discutan, que hablen de nuestras aportaciones y que se discuta lo que es la negritud en Puerto Rico. Y eso mismo hablaba yo ahorita con Marcos, el mismo comentario de que estamos en Puerto Rico bien atrasados. Hay gente que lo está hablando y hay gente que sí lo está discutiendo, no es que estemos en cero, pero cuando nosotros comenzamos hace 23 años en COPI, es hablar de negros y hablar de la negritud siendo una comunidad negra, pues fue bien difícil. Comenzar ese proceso, ese camino, fue completamente difícil porque no había necesidad, pero porque es que ustedes están hablando, qué es lo que ustedes están diciendo. Así que eran muchas situaciones las que todavía invisibilizaban lo que era la situación y lo que sigue siendo la situación de nuestras comunidades negras en Puerto Rico. Así que traemos la historia de Schomburg y la vamos convirtiendo en ese centro importante de discusión. Y aprendemos de que Schomburg, por ejemplo, cuando habla un momento y hace un escrito sobre José Campeche, cuando leo sobre Schomburg, cuando leo lo que escribe Schomburg sobre José Campeche, es como caramba, yo digo, él estaba escribiendo su propia historia de alguna manera, porque él está diciendo, miren, los blancos españoles, aunque allí hay una placa que habla de José Campeche, nadie sabe quién es José Campeche. No se reconoce a José Campeche. Entonces, Schomburg empieza a encaminarnos, a reconocernos a nosotros mismos, a decirle a nuestra gente, mira, somos esta persona, que es la otra, el artista, el médico, la mujer, quienes sean de nuestras comunidades, somos esto. Empieza a dar ese reconocimiento a la gente, a las aportaciones, a las historias. Y eso es lo que nosotros hemos ido haciendo en la comunidad de Piñones desde COPI, ahora sumándonos también en la aportación con el Corredor Afro, de estar en un legado y de reconocer ese legado de nuestra gente. Hablar de nuestras historias, lo que no nos enseñan en la escuela no aprendimos, en la escuela en Puerto Rico, en la escuelita de donde yo vengo de Piñones, nunca jamás me hablaron de Schomburg. Por lo tanto, nosotros tenemos la responsabilidad de hablarle a nuestros niños, a las mujeres, a los hombres, de quién es Schomburg. Y hemos hecho varias actividades y en el 2016, celebrando el natalicio de Schomburg, el 24, fue un domingo, recuerdo, el 24 de enero del 2016, hicimos una actividad histórica, grandiosa, para mí súper importante, con muy poco presupuesto, como siempre, históricamente también tenemos que hacer cosas sin chavos, pero un grupo de gente colaboró y nos unimos para ponerle nombre a la calle, idea que me la dio un día Benecer, así hablando como los locos, como decimos acá en Puerto Rico. Y entonces, pues convoqué a un grupo de gente que dijimos presente para darle un nombre a la calle, que de la 187, de la única carretera que hay en la comunidad, la carretera principal conecta a nuestro centro cultural. Y ahí pusimos el nombre de Schomburg, pero para nosotros hasta diseñar en colectivo. Eso no fue un diseño de una persona, sino diseñamos el letrero, lo queríamos rojo, ¿por qué? Y es importante que tuviera la foto de Schomburg, porque por lo general los letreros de las calles están con el nombre de la persona, pero nosotros queríamos que tuviese la cara de Schomburg. Luego, otro amigo, otro compañero, Raúl Berríos, dijo, Mari, pero ¿y por qué no hacemos un dibujo de Schomburg, un mural? Yo, bueno, dale para adelante. Así que hicimos también un mural de Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, y lo importante de todo esto, primero, que lo hizo la gente con lo que teníamos, con lo que pudimos, pero también es la primera calle de Piñones, es la primera calle de cuando usted entra de Isla Verde hacia Piñones. El primer nombre, de hecho, es la única calle en la comunidad que tiene un nombre. Así que para nosotros era importante que ese nombre fuera de Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, por esa importancia de, como yo le llamo, Arturo Schomburg el libertador, porque nos deja un legado de que pensemos en nuestra historia, que articulemos nuestras propias historias y que podamos difundir esa historia a las demás personas y a nuestras generaciones, las presentes y las futuras. Así que nos unimos ese grupo de personas, y allí pues dimos una de tantas actividades que hemos hecho para reconocer ese legado de Schomburg, para aprender y, como digo, para desaprender también de los mitos que nos han dicho, no sobre Schomburg, sino sobre nuestra identidad como afrodescendientes. Así que parte de lo que nosotros hacemos es que los niños, que las niñas de la comunidad conozcan a Schomburg. Hace como un año atrás o 2 años, no recuerdo, reciente, hicimos entonces en el Corredor Afro una actividad que a mí me fascinó, me gustó mucho, que fue también un domingo y hacer el natalicio. Cantamos un bizcocho, buscamos nos decoraron un bizcocho con la cara de Arturo Alfonso Schomburg para que los niños y las nenas del barrio pudieran conocer a Schomburg. Así que hemos buscado maneras creativas, ahí con Iris Miriam Felicier, que escribió entonces la historia de Schomburg para niños, pues vino a la Miriam y leyó a los niños y las nenas de la comunidad la historia de Schomburg. Así que esa parte de traducir lo académico a lo práctico, a la praxis, al trabajo con la comunidad, a poder traducir, desmenuzar esa historia para que nuestros niños y nuestras niñas la conozcan, es como esa parte de aportación y pequeña contribución que yo siento puedo hacer para transmitir esa información tan valiosa que ha dejado Schomburg y que es ese componente importante de rescatar esa historia, pero no guardarla en un lugar, sino transmitirla a los demás para que siga dando esa luz, para que sea ese camino del entendimiento que tenemos, de la sabiduría que nosotros tenemos y que podemos seguir aportando. Así que eso ha sido un poquito de lo que nosotros hemos podido hacer desde la comunidad de Piñones para que nuestra gente conozca más de Schomburg. Ojalá y la carretera completa, grande, llevar el nombre de Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Sí,
Gracias.
Qué
Mari.
bonito eso de cantar de cumpleaños. Eso es lo que es la memoria viva. Eso es prácticamente y esas son las pedagogías que abren, ¿verdad?, caminos y conciencia.
Sí, también es importante, importante ver que la inteligencia, ¿verdad? Y el trabajo es de comunidad a universidad a comunidad, right? Que uno tiene, now we have the opportunity as people who are in different places and in different experiences to sort of knit together, right? The information and the activism that I think represents the work of Schomburg. right? That was the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was bringing everybody together with some experience of knowledge, of art, of creativity, right? When he writes to Nicolas Guillen, he's writing to a poet, yes, but he's writing to his brother, right? And he admits that and acknowledges that in his letters, not like he's talking to somebody distant, right? So that as we continue this journey, one of the pieces that sort of ignited me when I read Josanna's piece was the intentionality, right, of being Masons, right? Because generally speaking, when we look, or at least I looked at Schomburg, I understood his coming of age in New York City at the age of 17, and that was to me a 17-year-old comes to New York City to work for the independence of Puerto Rico, right? To commit to the independence of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and joins La Dos Islas, right? And joins groups. And his mentors are all Masons, right? Jose Marti, Betances are Masons. So we wanted to have Masons on the panel that would enlighten us even further in terms of the spirituality, the knowledge, the values, the ethics. Because in my head, we bring that, right, with African traditions. We already come with that when we're torn out of Africa, that comes into the Americas. And how it's formalized and how it's made into a practice and different practices is key. So we would love to hear from James.
So y'all expect me to follow behind all of that? Y'all sisters just dropped it. I thought we were getting ready to wrap up.
Oh no, James. Now we're just getting started.
Oh man.
We're getting started.
Well, first of all, good evening, everybody. My name is James R. Morgan III. I am a past master of Corinthian Lodge number 18 here in Washington, D.C. I serve as the Grand Historian and Archivist of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. I'm an author. I've written a book, The Lost Empire, Black Freemasonry in the Old West. But beyond all of that, I'm a Howard grad. I'm a Morgan State, soon to be Morgan State University grad. But beyond all of that, I consider myself to be an intellectual great grandson of Arturo Schomburg. And the reason why I say that is because one of my close mentors, Dr. Greg Carr, was closely mentored by Dr. John Henry Clark. And if anyone knows anything about Dr. Clark, you know that story about when he went up there to Schomburg and he told him, he called him on his lunch break. And for those who don't know, he said he wanted to know everything about the Black world and Black history right now, right then in his lunch hour. And Schomburg told him, he said, well, sit down. He said, the things that you are calling Negro history or Black history are in fact the missing pages of world history. Okay. And so this is a discussion that I'm grateful to be on this evening. And in that regard, I'd like to give, in the tradition of our ancestors, we always have to start off with that ancestral veneration, right? So I would give honor to a man I consider to be my intellectual forefather, my abuelo, right, in Arturo Schomburg. One of the things that struck me during this conversation that I think relates right back to the topic at hand is it was listening to Marta Cruz speak. The issue that I had was that I don't speak Spanish, right? And I thought about Schomburg as a bridge figure even in that conversation, right? As we think about Africans and the African experience being ripped from Africa, brought over to the Americas, which, by the way, there's no one African language to begin with, right? So now we're taking people who spoke various languages, forcing them to learn primarily English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, right? And then you're mixing them up, blending, reblending, and then once they're all emancipated, they get to a place called Harlem, New York. And they're finding out that some of the issues that they are having, whether it's in Puerto Rico, whether it's in Dominican Republic, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in Alabama, where my ancestors, if you look behind me, where my own personal ancestors are from on my mother's side, they're finding out and figuring out that we have a lot of the same issues. As a matter of fact, when they start getting real deep into it, they start realizing that they're cousins, right? And so when you talk about Freemasonry and you bring that aspect into the equation, we have to start off at the beginning. I would start off with Prince Hall in the 1700s and thinking about the African Lodge that he establishes, African Lodge 459, not just as a Masonic lodge, as an organization, but also as using it, thinking about it. And I like Josiana's your language earlier, the imagination of liberation, right? So thinking about that not just as a physical space or even as an organizational space, but also as as an imaginative space of saying we recognize the diversity that we all represent, whether it was as a membership at that time or even on this panel tonight. We recognize the diversity, but we also have to recognize the commonality, which is that African origin. Okay. Schomburg himself, in joining the lodge, he's joining an organization that has that as a philosophical underpinning to begin with. He joins an organization that already has individuals in it from generations prior to his, such as David Walker, such as Martin R. Delaney, okay, such as Henry Highland Garnett, we mentioned him earlier, Hiram Rhodes Revels, Blanche K. Bruce. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And what Schomburg does is he sits at a very interesting nexus point and continues that link of being a Pan-Africanist, of having that Black nationalist leaning, right? But he's not alone. And that's one of the keys about organizations is in community. It's recognizing that the work that you're doing is not just for you and by yourself in your little corner. Schomburg, yeah, we know he's a bibliophile, and sometimes bibliophiles, book people, we have a tendency to have reputations to be loners because we're always off somewhere with a book. But that's not the case, right? Schomburg is in a league and in a generation with intellectuals, particularly Masonic intellectuals, who aren't always people produced by the traditional academy, right? But who are some powerhouses such as Harry A. Williamson, such as Johnny Bruce or Bruce Britt, right? Never mind. We haven't even touched Marcus Garvey yet, right? In a generation where that is the nexus point, and what he does is he utilizes, as others had done before him and after him, I would argue, he utilizes his Masonic membership for liberation, and so he establishes El Sol de Cuba Lodge number 38, which is the first Spanish-speaking lodge for Prince Hall Freemasons, which of course, where else would it be except New York, right? When you start to think about it, okay? He establishes that lodge and becomes its first worshipful master. That lodge has since changed its name to Prince Hall Lodge number 38. But let's be clear about one thing. The lodge that he established still functions to this day, okay? Let's be clear about that. Schomburg then moves on and becomes the Grand Secretary of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the state of New York, which, by the way, does anybody know how many Puerto Rican Grand Secretaries the Prince Hall Masons of New York have had? 2. Schomburg and their current Grand Secretary, my good friend Sandino Sanchez. So I want to give a shout out to him.
Sandino.
Exactly. See, the world gets small when you get these organizations, right? See what I mean?
Yes.
And so, not to hog the microphone, but Schomburg sits at an important nexus point, not only in that regard, but also as a scholar in his own right, as we already know, but also as a scholar and an activist, even within the Masonic world. Many people don't know, but I hope that after we're gonna dispel this right now. A lot of folks don't realize that Schomburg was a Masonic author too. Okay, so Schomburg actually publishes his book, Masonic Truths, where he really takes white American Freemasonry and white American supremacy to task for the hypocrisy. And so one of the things, I'm sorry, Siri going off. One of the things that Schomburg does is he takes white Freemasonry and really white American supremacy to task for the hypocrisy. And I just want to read you something, because I really come from the school of we need to be the vectors to let the ancestors speak sometimes. So I just want to read to you all something really quickly from Masonic Truths. This is from the opening page, where he says that we are reminded that in all communities of men, it should be recognized that before God, before the law, and in the enjoyment of public utilities, all men are equal, and women. I got to throw women in there. It is an axiomatic principle evolved from the highest known ethics of the age and in the estimation of justice, the only standard of excellence is that which rests upon the tripod of physical, intellectual, and spiritual development. Upon these fundamental ideas must forever rest the structure of that future national life which will ultimately bind all mankind into one universal brotherhood. Now, that's all true. Now let's scroll down a little bit to the bottom of this page. This is on page 2. He says, what the Prince Hall Masons are seeking is only non-interference with their humble patrimony. They are in all things unconcerned with the brilliancy of wealth that permeates white Masonic associations, whether these are in themselves clandestine or as regular as driven snow in its whiteness. Prince Hall Masons in America are the last persons who are desirous of promiscuously slipping into white lodges to be purposely denied a privilege well known as an inherent right of subordinate lodges. He may look for that expression of brotherhood abroad, and where in the language of Burns, quote, a man is a man for a that and a that, and where men are schooled in the true elements that go to make the universality of the craft, and where masonry can be the real handmaid of that true religion. I mean, mic drop.
Wow, wow, wow.
So just in closing, I would just say, I'm honored to be here once again. And I think that the fact that we are engaging in this conversation tonight and engaging in this work and sharing notes and contact information and folks in the chat, we are continuing the work of the great Arturo Schomburg. And I'm honored and privileged to be another link in that same chain with the work that I do. So thank you all. And I'll move on for the next speaker.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was so enriching. Thank you. Thank you. And I'd like to move forward to Alex Lasalle, who has been in my life for, he's one of the babies that has sort of developed through the center and through the work that I have done. And it is only maybe 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago that I found out that he was a Mason as well. So, Alex, look forward to your contributions.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you to all. That was great. Thank you, Brother James. Thank you so much, and to every other one of the panelists. I mean, I first learned about Arturo Schomburg while I was researching Bomba, the Afro-Puerto Rican musical tradition and cultural tradition, right? And we're talking mid to late 90s now. And I go to the Schomburg Center in Harlem, and I'm like, okay. And the center, I had no clue who he was. And then I started to speak to a friend of mine, who's a fellow bombero. And he says, well, you do know that he was also Puerto Rican, right? I was like, get out of here, please, Puerto Rican, so the more I started looking at it, I really, started delving deep into who Schomburg was. But what's interesting about Schomburg is when you consider the time frame where that he lived and where he worked and what he was doing, the time frame. It was a time when, one, Freemasonry was at its height. More members than in any other time in history, and it was especially true during the Harlem Renaissance, and from the early 1900s up until the 1940s, 50s, you saw a vast amount of Freemasons. But also, what I found interesting in my research was that he was using Freemasonry as a tool, what he learned within the lodge as a tool to really push forward education, right? And the education of African peoples and their history. In a time when that was, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of internet problems here. We had an outage this morning, so my camera may come on and off from time to time. And as he's, really pushing forward, he is considered to be the father of African history in the Americas. But he did this he was an amazing individual. He learns English when he comes over here to New York. You know, his Spanish was his primary language. He learns English here in New York already as an adult, and then masters it and masters other languages as well. Because one thing about Schomburg, who was also recognized by Betances, another fellow Freemason, that you had to know the multiple languages that were being spoken in the Caribbean in order to really get the message that you want of liberation, liberation of African peoples, through, if you wanted to get it across, because you had folks from Haiti, which Arturo Schomburg studied heavily, the Haitian culture, that spoke French Creole. You had Jamaican Patois, which was the English Patois. Folks that were speaking Papiamentu from the Dutch-speaking Caribbean. Of course, the Creole that we speak in Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, which is a Spanish Creole. And so, he understood this. He really brought this together. And as a Freemason, if I have to say one thing about Freemasonry, it's the fact that it's about taking a good man and making him better. So you are the whole point of it is to become better than you already were, to grow, to become wiser, to fill yourself with a power that's more powerful than anything else, which is knowledge. And the more you know, and he knew that the more people knew about themselves, the more people knew about their history, the more people knew about their culture, the more powerful they would be, the more they would be able to contribute to the society, to communities, right? And in particular to the African diaspora within the Americas, because he started that whole movement, and he was alongside with Garvey, and he was with Betances, he was with amazing leaders of the time, moving forward in a work that was unheard of at that time, right? It was really like there was very few and in between. And he used Freemasonry to really encourage like a deep understanding of who we were as a people and who we are, under the umbrella of the Supreme Being and the guidance of the Supreme Being. Because one thing about Freemasonry is you can come from all types of religious backgrounds, as long as you believe in a God. Doesn't matter what God you believe in. Doesn't matter if you when I was sworn in as a Freemasonry and I had to use the name, I would refer to God always as Sam Biampung, and it was accepted. And I had a brother who did his, who was initiated under the Odus of Ifa. He printed out all of the Odus of Ifa, and he was sworn in under the Odus of Ifa. So it's amazing to see how this kind of like spills over till today. We still have folks coming together from all walks of life, and these were things that were started in the times of Schomburg by Schomburg and other brothers of the time, found in Freemasonry. So I come into this more as an admirer of Schomburg's work, as an admirer of what he pushed forward and the belief that he pushed forward. And yeah. Thank you guys. I'll pass it down to
Thank you, Alex.
Anissa.
Ebenezer.
March.
And I have to say thank you to Ebenezer, because it's Ebenezer's invitation to speak to the Lawyers Association in honoring Schomburg that I find Johanna's work. So this is a circle of information and connections. So
Yes.
gracias, Ebenezer.
Yes, Marta, James wants to add something.
Maravilloso. No sabía ese detalle. Qué maravilloso. Nos seguimos en
Aguanta un
contacto.
momentico. Yeah, James.
James.
I apologize, but if I let this pass, I'm gonna get in trouble when I get off this thing. When I get off this chat, I gotta make sure I acknowledge I misspoke. The New York has had 3 Puerto Rican grand secretaries: Schomburg, Pedro Rivera Bay, who is a friend of mine, and I don't know how I neglected that. I apologize, Pedro, if you're watching. and Sandino Sanchez. If I don't address that now, I'm gonna be in trouble when I leave about this
Well, we
apartment.
don't want you to be in trouble, but we were circling back to you anyway because you dropped Marcus Garvey, and
Yeah.
that's another hero that we need
Yeah,
to
Sandino,
address.
someone said that Sandino's Dominican, by the way.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so you don't get into ethnic issues.
Gotcha. See, I'm messing up. I'm messing up all in the.
Well, Sandino, I know also is one of the babies. I was trying to get him on the panel, and we kept missing each other. So, Ebenezer, gracias.
Bueno, pues gracias a ti por incluirme en este hermoso panel. Gracias a todos los que están participando. La verdad es que el reto es grande de seguir conociendo a Schomburg. Tengo que conseguir el libro de Josiana, yo no recuerdo haberlo tenido. Así que me alineo para seguir creciendo. Cuando hablamos de Schomburg, yo siempre planteo que tenemos que tener un punto de arranque. Y vamos a hablar de Schomburg para venerarlo, o vamos a hablar de Schomburg para conocerlo y de ahí poder continuar su obra. Y planteo esto porque creo que es uno de los temas de este panel que habla de los mitos. Pues es muy importante también que abundemos en unos posibles mitos que hay que todavía hay que esclarecer. Y yo digo, por ejemplo, Schomburg se dice que a los 17 años llegó a Nueva York. Y me pregunto, a los 17 años llegó solo, siendo un menor de edad. Pregunto, las leyes de Estados Unidos, que no eran las de Puerto Rico estaba bajo el dominio español. Y Schomburg no era ni siquiera ciudadano español. Así que las leyes de Estados Unidos permitían que un menor de edad llegara por su cuenta allí, sin que hubiese un desastre por el medio, una cuestión humanitaria, sencillamente por llegar. Vamos a suponer que sí, y que lo permitiera siendo menor de edad, lo cual yo dudo. Había otro detalle, ¿a dónde llegó Schomburg? Schomburg tiene que haber llegado a Ellis Island, donde llegaban todos los inmigrantes. Y en Ellis Island, los inmigrantes se bajaban allí, los bajaban y no seguían caminando, como decimos aquí, Pedro, por su casa, sino que había un registro, había un chequeo, y tenían que decir para dónde van y quién lo invitó, como se hace normalmente todo el que inmigra a otro país. Y yo creo que eso es un récord que hay que buscar. Los compañeros y compañeras que están en los Estados Unidos y que tienen más cercanía allí a los récords de Ellis Island donde estén, obviamente no pueden haberse movido de sitio, pues debieran investigar que cuándo fue que Schomburg realmente llegó y cuando llegó, de qué país se identificó, qué credencial, si alguna, mostró como carnet de identidad, para saber si era cubano, si era puertorriqueño, si era venezolano, si era ecuatoriano, cómo se distinguía una cosa de la otra. Porque si era, por ejemplo, de Jamaica, pues sabíamos que ahí eso era un reino de Inglaterra. Y si era de Cuba, todavía a ese tiempo era España, igual que Puerto Rico. Así que son preguntas que yo todavía no he visto que se estén analizando y trabajando, y creo que son importantes para poder esclarecer más sobre Schomburg. El otro detalle es cuando Schomburg llega a Estados Unidos, a la edad que fuera, entra la masonería. La masonería tampoco es un lugar donde la gente entra porque quiere. No es cuestión de, yo quiero ser masón y yo voy a una dosis y me apunto. No es así. Para entrar a la hermandad, a la fraternidad masónica en cualquier subvertiente, hay un proceso de acercamiento al candidato y un proceso de selección. Así que alguien invitó a Schomburg, alguien entendió que él tenía los méritos, que tenía las cualidades, que tenía las virtudes, que podía desarrollarse en un líder, que podía desarrollarse en un maestro, que podía desarrollarse en alguien de valor para muchos otros que estaban buscando, igual que él, conocimiento, sabiduría, fortaleza, amparo. Así que, ¿quién invitó a Schomburg a ser masón? Es otro punto que yo creo que se debe también investigar, porque de eso trae. Porque quien invita a alguien casi siempre lo invita porque ve en él su semejanza, su imagen y semejanza. Yo soy masón y soy Otfero, que es otra fraternidad mucho más pequeña que la masonería. Pero cuando yo invito a alguien a ser de la logia de cualquiera de las dos es porque veo en él virtudes que yo me identifico con ellas. Si entiendo que no las tiene, no lo invito. Así que, ¿quién invitó a Schomburg? ¿Qué buscaba esa persona con Schomburg? cómo Schomburg llega, se integra y empieza a dar de lo poquito que tenía, porque era un inmigrante. Schomburg no era rico ni mucho menos, y estaba como otros muchos buscando un empleo, y estaba como otros muchos siendo víctima de la persecución por la alegada raza, del hostigamiento, del discrimen. Porque no piensa usted que Schomburg llegó allí o recibieron la sociedad con manos abiertas. Yo creo que tuvo también muchos agravios y muchas situaciones incómodas que superar. Y yo creo que eso es bien importante que lo veamos. De ahí es que sale, me parece a mí, que alguien lo invita a unirse a la fraternidad masónica, que también en este tiempo, recuerden que estamos hablando fines del siglo XIX, principios del siglo XX, donde en Nueva York y en otras muchas ciudades, las poblaciones negras tenían una gran lucha por alcanzar derechos, por alcanzar el voto, por alcanzar trabajo, por superarse y poder acomodarse en ocupaciones no tradicionales. Y Schomburg se junta a eso. Obviamente un hombre bien inteligente, que es tipógrafo. Recuerden que en el caso de Puerto Rico, los dos grupos ocupacionales de mayor conocimiento y sabiduría de ordinario eran los tipógrafos, porque por su oficio leían todo lo que llegaba y todo lo que salía, y los los de tabaco, los tabaqueros, claro, los tabaqueros, porque en los centros de trabajar el tabaco, de hacer todo el despalillado, etcétera, etcétera, se hablaba y se leía, y había una figura que se llamaba el lector. Y ese lector tenía que ser una persona de voz clara, que supiese leer de forma tal que todo el mundo escuchase. Recuerde que no había altoparlantes, ni había cámaras de televisión, no había nada de eso. Así que alguien que pudiese leer con una capacidad y una cualidad que fuese entendible por todo. Y eso llevaba a que muchos que no sabían leer ni escribir, sin embargo se convertían en personas muy doctas y sabían de literatura y de novelas y de historia y de política, y llegaba el periódico de España y el lector lo leía, y llegaba el periódico de otro sitio y el lector lo leía, y las novelas que en ese momento eran novedosas. Así que eran dos grupos especiales, uno los tabaqueros, los otros tipógrafos, y Schomburg venía del grupo de los tipógrafos. Así que cuando llega a Nueva York, obviamente busca a los que entienden que son sus iguales, empieza a buscar gente que está en la lucha por saber, por conocer, por hacer, y de ahí a transformar. Así que me parece que es un punto que hay que explorar todavía en cuanto a Schomburg, porque hay mucho todavía que conocer, en mi humilde opinión, y mucho que decir. Volviendo a la masonería, una vez usted es masón, si usted es masón de verdad, como si es fero de verdad, usted se aboca a la ayuda de los otros. Usted se compromete con el crecimiento de los otros, que es lo que le va a dar el crecimiento suyo, porque es una relación recíproca. Si yo no ayudo a mi hermano no crece, yo tampoco crezco. Es la famosa frase que estamos aprendiendo, Ubuntu, yo soy porque tú eres, ¿verdad? Una reciprocidad. Mi esfuerzo tiene que estar ligado al tuyo, porque mi futuro está indefectiblemente ligado al tuyo. Así que Schomburg en ese sentido se convirtió de verdad en un gran maestro y empezó a dar de lo poco que tenía para lograr hacer lo mucho que logró y que compartió. Ese trabajo de ser secretario de una gran loja titánico, eso es un trabajo que no acaba nunca, eso es un trabajo que requiere infinidad de horas dedicada a buscar correspondencia, a leer correspondencia, a escribir, a hacer boletines, llevar minutos, llevar actas, o sea, un trabajo, y que Schomburg hubiese aceptado esa tarea y haber dedicado esa parte de su tiempo más importante de la masonería por 30 años, no se puede más sentado en un banco escribiendo, sino que hay que verlo como que estaba creciendo continuamente, compartiendo, haciendo, aprendiendo y enseñando. Y no solamente en Nueva York, porque hay muchos escritos que citan a Schomburg en diferentes estados, yendo a dar conferencias y abrir logias y hacer ceremonias. Así que era una persona muy reputada y muy requerida por las autoridades masónicas, así como por las autoridades culturales de diferentes centros. Y yo creo que eso es un área que también hay que profundizar. Así que él no era masón por pertenecer a un grupo, sino que era masón porque fue una vía que encontró para aportar, para crecer y a la misma vez ayudar a crecer a otros seres humanos. La cuestión de la filosofía masónica otra vez, recuerden que no puede quedarse en el vacío. Filosofía sin hechos pues es vacía, por eso que se habla de praxis. Uno tiene que pensar, crecer intelectualmente, pero a la misma vez hacer tareas, obras, que es lo que permite que los conocimientos se refinen y las actitudes y las habilidades se modelen de una manera pues superior y excepcional. Y yo creo que Arturo Schomburg sin duda lo logró. En cuanto a la cuestión de su participación política, pues Schomburg viene de un país satélite o un país colonia de España. En Puerto Rico no se podía practicar la masonería. La Iglesia Católica era enemiga de la masonería y la corona la prohibía. Así que los masones tenían que operar normalmente desde la clandestinidad. Y esa clandestinidad, a la misma vez que les protegía, también les permitía entrar en conversaciones muy cercanas, ¿verdad?, a la cuestión de la conspiración y en otros muchos casos conspiración. Así que en el caso de Puerto Rico la masonería era prohibida y la corona la perseguía. Así que cuando Schomburg se va para Nueva York, por la razón que sea, el día que fuera, el año que fuera, cuando yo allí, y descubre la cuestión masónica que alguien tiene que haberlo invitado, pues obviamente encuentra ese otro punto de la cuestión política. Porque posiblemente el mismo que lo llevó a la masonería también lo llevó o ayudó a entender la situación política que quizás desde Puerto Rico no podía entender como entendía desde España, desde Nueva York, porque allí se hablaba diferente y había más libertad de los revolucionarios y de los que estaban por romper el yugo tiránico y colonial de España con Puerto Rico y con Cuba. Allí podían hablar. Por eso era que Lola Rodríguez de Pío también estuvo en Nueva York y Pachín Marín también estuvo en Nueva York, e infinidad de revolucionarios puertorriqueños pues estuvieron en Nueva York temporadas, ¿verdad? Así que esa cuestión de entrar a la política también tiene que haber sido motivada por su inserción en las luchas sociales y políticas que habían en Nueva York y en los Estados Unidos. Por otro lado, recuerden que la cuestión de la guerra no surge de la noche a la mañana. Esos cuentos no lo hacen, ¿verdad? Que fulano hizo algo y empezó una guerra, ¿no? Las guerras son planificadas por los estados, a veces con 20, 30 años de anticipación, y están esperando un momento para crear un motivo y entonces desatar la guerra. Así que Estados Unidos llevaba décadas tratando de apoderarse de parte de República Dominicana, la bahía de Samaná, entre otros lugares, y de apoderarse de Puerto Rico para tener su bastión en el Caribe. Recordemos también que en 1871, si mal no recuerdo, República Dominicana estuvo a punto de convertirse en estado de los Estados Unidos y hubo una votación en el Senado de los Estados Unidos y esa votación se colgó por un voto, ¿verdad? Así que el interés de los Estados Unidos de tener una base, un lugar en el Caribe, era patente y posiblemente eso también era un asunto que se agitaba para sacar a España de la isla. O sea, yo creo que eso también se combinaba. Así que a pesar de no solo la opresión que causaba España a los puertorriqueños, no solo esa opresión, sino intereses, en este caso de Estados Unidos, incidían para que Cuba y Puerto Rico se independizaran. Y Schomburg lee ese libro, entiende eso, se une porque es consono con su pensamiento, con lo que aprendió, y me parece que desde ese punto de vista redefinió su vida. También posiblemente por eso, y ahí las compañeras y compañeros que han estudiado mucho esto, me pueden dar luz, quizás también porque redefinió su vida, fue que en un momento dado abandonó la lucha por la independencia, pensando que era imposible, que ya Puerto Rico no iba a ser independiente, que había pasado de ser colonia de España,
Eso es verdad.
una nación en precario, ¿verdad? Y perdiendo poder a Estados Unidos, que era el titán de la llanura, que era el país emergente, que era el país que estaba redefiniendo el mundo, que era el país que estaba redefiniendo las relaciones entre los grupos humanos llamados raza, era el grupo de Estados Unidos, el país que había decidido hacer un estado nuevo allá en África, Liberia, ¿verdad? Para que los negros se pudieran ir para allá. Era el país que estaba tratando de establecer en Cuba una base también para que los negros norteamericanos pudieran irse para Cuba y para otros lugares. Así que todo eso, yo estoy seguro que en mayor o menor medida incidió en Schomburg y llegó llegó, la palabrita que olvidó, pero llegó a quitarle la seguridad de que iba a haber la independencia y entendió entonces que debía dejar eso a un lado y dedicarse a otras labores, como fue la labor masónica, que ya hemos hablado, yo creo que mucho, y la labor cultural, la labor de recolección, de acopio de materiales escritos, todo lo que ya sabemos que hizo para establecer que los negros sí tenían historia y la importancia de la aportación de los negros a la historia universal, en particular a la de los Estados Unidos y América. Así que él tomó esa otra alternativa para seguir aportando, seguir creciendo, y yo creo que el mundo ha sido totalmente injusto con Schomburg. En Estados Unidos está la colección Schomburg, ella en 135 y Lenox. Yo la visité la primera vez en el 1981, cuando hice la investigación para preparar lo que después es el documental El legado de Arturo Schomburg. Y obviamente en aquel tiempo me maravillé y ahora está todavía mucho más increíble, ¿verdad? Así que me parece que esa colección que recoge los trabajos de Schomburg, pues debió haberse duplicado en muchos. Yo sé que Fisk University y otros lugares siguieron esa trayectoria, pero simplemente se pudo haber hecho más y se debe hacer más. En Puerto Rico no hay una sola biblioteca ni colección dedicada a la historia del negro y su función y su participación en la humanidad. No hay una sola. Hace unos años, el Concilio Puertorriqueño contra el Racismo, junto a la Miriam Felicier y otras personas, intentamos tomar un edificio que hay en San Juan, ahí frente al Parque Muñoz Rivera, con un edificio pequeño, pero con una arquitectura muy bonita y muy digna de una librería, de una biblioteca. Pero obviamente tenían otros usos y no nos lo concedieron, y ahora es otra cosa que dice. Pero Puerto Rico tiene que volver a tomar con decisión el crear la biblioteca sobre la historia del negro y de la negra de Puerto Rico, en conjunto con la historia de la humanidad. Eso es una tarea que la hemos repetido mucho en los últimos 40 años. En ese tiempo, Maricruz tenía como 2 años, yo creo, así que no podía participar. Pero en los últimos 40 años hemos estado trabajando intensamente y ya pues algunos estamos un poquito más cansados que otros, y también hay gente nueva con unas energías y unas visiones maravillosas que yo creo que hay que dejarle de espacio, pero me parece que es una tarea importante. Y vinculando a Schomburg con el corredor afro, me parece que es un atisbo de lo mucho que se puede hacer, un poquitititito de lo mucho que se puede, que hay que hacer. Y yo creo que en ese sentido, nuestra compañera Marta Moreno Vega se diferencia de otros muchos y muchas líderes que han estado muy activos en Nueva York, y cuando vienen a Puerto Rico se apagan. Y ella pues no tiene luz y sigue dando luz y sigue promoviendo. Y para mí no estoy dándole, como decimos en la calle, no estoy dándole coba, pero hay que reconocer la gente. Y me parece que es un trabajo muy importante que está haciendo, y que yo espero que Dios también le dé mucho tiempo para seguir dando fruto. Deme un segundo para ver si me queda algo por aquí que quería comenzar, porque a veces uno habla y después se va a otro sitio. A otro punto que hay que también explorar, que yo creo que el compañero, no sé si fue Josiana o fue David, lo mencionó, era el interés de Arturo Alfonso Schomburg por la negritud en el sentido cubano, todas las aportaciones de la cubanía, todas las implicaciones que tenía por todas las culturas africanas que convergieron en Cuba y que le dieron forma a la cultura cubana, le dieron participación intensa, participaron intensamente en la formación de lo que es Cuba. Y él tomó de su tiempo y de su esfuerzo y por lo menos hizo, que yo sepa, por lo menos un viaje a Cuba, donde fue a buscar esa información, esa semilla para seguir sembrando. Fue maltratado allá por unos intelectuales cubanos y por unos periodistas. Interesante, ¿verdad? Porque pues la posición de algunos periodistas era que él iba como si fuese en una misión de buscar riqueza para su colección, y él no buscaba riqueza, él buscaba conocimiento, compartir, aprender y dar. Y me parece que esa es otra línea que hay que seguir explorando y conocer si es que Schomburg fue más de una vez a Cuba y realmente en qué culminó su acercamiento a Cuba, si dejó alguna semilla cultural, si algún grupo tomó el nombre de Schomburg, si además de una y otra carta que alguien escribía desde Cuba, si hubo un movimiento mucho más robusto en términos culturales con la hermana Antilla. Así que me parece que podemos estar día y hora hablando de Schomburg, pero lo importante es conocerlo cada día más. No podemos convertirlo en Dios, no podemos convertirlo en superhombre porque él no lo fue. Él fue un hombre de pasiones, muchas pasiones, y qué buenas son las pasiones, ¿verdad? Fue un hombre de choques y de fracasos, y qué bueno es cuando se choca y se fracasa, porque se aprende. Y fue un hombre de mucho empuje, y sin tener títulos doctorales ni mucho menos, se codeaba con lo mejor de la aristocracia negra, aristocracia intelectual negra en los Estados Unidos. Y fue por eso reconocido, y cuando murió el 9 de junio de 1938, los periódicos de Estados Unidos expresaron infinidad de condolencias, ¿verdad? Y levantaron el brillo de su obra, aunque fuera por poco tiempo. Así que gracias por permitirme compartir estas ideas.
Gracias, Benezel. Me gustaría go back to James and to Alex, because the words of spirituality emerge, of ritual emerge. And I think that the importance of ritual, right, of spirituality, and in context to masonry and Schomburg, should be explored or addressed. So can we ask you to think about that, as well as, James, you threw out Marcus Garvey, and that is a key point that we should not let go.
Sure. So one of the things that I argue about Freemasonry and thinking about how would an African in the 1700s, like Prince Hall and the others who existed at that time, and by others I'm thinking about individuals such as Bishop Richard Allen, such as Absalom Jones, such as Reverend Thomas Paul, right? How would individuals who lived at a time where maybe they themselves were born on this side of the water somewhere, but they're in contact with Africans who had been born and lived entire lives in West Africa. Maybe their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, others in their community, whether they were enslaved or free at birth. How would they have viewed an organization like Freemasonry? I am of the school of thought that years later, when you start getting into Martin Delaney and whatnot, folks like to take the African origin of Freemasonry route and try to take it back to ancient Egypt and Nile Valley and this and third. And that's a conversation that's been had over the years. But I personally like to have the conversation about how would a West African have viewed Freemasonry. And in many aspects, I think that they would have viewed it in some ways as being like the white man's Vodun in certain key ways, right? And so when you think about in the Afro-Caribbean experience, when you get into the origins of Santeria and Vodun and Gumi and all these different things, in those contexts, one of the things that you find with the syncreticism is that what's one of the through lines? It becomes Catholicism, right? In the American Anglo-oriented world, you don't have that same through line, right? I would argue, and I think I could back this up at least to some degree. I would argue that Freemasonry fills that cultural and sociological gap in the
Mm.
African American kind of experience in many ways, and I think that that's something that when you look at African diaspora, when you look at diasporic Africans who join Freemasonry, you see some of the same kind of parallels in terms of how it's utilized for liberation purposes, right? How it serves a different sociological and even a different spiritual service, even as compared to white Masonic lodges in the same countries, whether that's in America or elsewhere, right? Their Masons are viewed differently in the community. And by the community, I mean the African descendant community versus and others. And I think that's because the initial cultural impulse coming from Africa is one where initiation, rites of passage, these are things that occur. And for those who haven't been to the continent, I've been twice. I've been to Egypt. And I've been to Nigeria. I can tell you right now, they got an initiation and a celebration and a ritual for darn near everything, to include, and I saw this with my own two eyes, to include when the local high school wins against a rival school in a soccer game or football, as you know, everyone else calls it outside the States, right? So ritual is not something, while the sanctity and the secrecy of it, especially when it comes to that rite of passage from boyhood to manhood, from girlhood to womanhood, right? That aspect of it is something that is secret. The particulars of ritual are not a secret. However, membership is not, right?
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
so that social function that I think that is displayed and that is expected. There's a certain cultural expectation in the African Masonic tradition, if you will, that the community has of you, because now you are not just a regular man or woman, for for the sisters in the Eastern Star. And
Yeah.
shout out to my sister Cynthia, because I saw her in the chat. You're not just a member of the community. You have now stepped out there as an initiate. You have now stepped out there as somebody who is in tune with a higher level of spirituality. And so now there's a certain obligation that, and a certain expectation that we didn't necessarily just put on you, but you put it on yourself. Because you stepped out there and you went down to that lodge, you got some information, and now there's a certain expectation of you, of how you are going to be viewed by the community and how you are going to work in the service of the community. And when you are found in error, the community will definitely let you know that. Okay. And so also I think when you talk about Marcus Garvey and the UNIA and the rise of his movement, I think what you're seeing in many ways is kind of a correlation of a lot of these factors that we're talking about tonight into a movement. I think that and I was just saying this to someone as I was preparing for this panel tonight, that I think that we need to continue to do our research and reverence in terms of Garvey and Garveyism, and thinking about Schomburg's connection to that. So now you're talking about, now we're not just talking about our Puerto Rican brothers and sisters and cousins. Now we got to bring our Jamaican brothers and sisters and cousins to the conversation with the African American brothers, and that's what ends up.
And Garvey traveled the whole Latin America and the Caribbean. So they were both in that same vibe.
Exactly. And I don't know, maybe someone here is wiser than me. I know of one photo of Marcus Garvey and
with Masonic. Yeah, there's one picture. Yes,
right.
There's one picture. But also Garvey will use Masonic regalia and parades. Like, he will definitely use all this the performance, right, of the ritual into the public space. It's not only
absolutely
rituals. It's, for him, it was a lingua franca.
I was going to say that it's a lingua franca that especially at that time period, that people understood and are already kind of familiar with to begin with. And then if you think about it just on a personal level, does anybody know where that photo was taken and what the event was that they were at? Anybody? That photo is actually at a funeral for Bruce Britt.
Oh,
Right?
Bruce Waite's funeral.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Who
Bruce
was
funeral.
a mentor probably for both of them, right?
Exactly. And he was a Mason as well. And
Yes.
so these relationships are not just pie in the sky or some esoteric stuff. These are interpersonal relationships as well. And so we even the fact that we have that image, and even the image that was used in the advertisement for this program tonight, it's of Schomburg with the
Williamson
then
and
Grand Master and the brothers. What are they standing in front of? They're not standing in front of the temple, not of the Masonic temple. They're not standing in front of, in front of church.
they're in front of a church. Yes.
Right. And I'm pretty sure is that Abyssinian? I'm not sure if that was
Yes,
Abyssinian.
Abyssinian. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
And that was my question for you, because I think U.S. Southern culture, and in particularly certain churches, I mean, and here I'm not going to go into all the Protestant different divisions, but I think cities like New Orleans, but also places like Alabama, I mean, like there's a church culture in the South that traces, I mean, particularly a Black church culture that traces the same kind of myths of origin and Egyptology and the base of tradition, that it's kind of conversant to what, but I completely agree that Prince Hall lodges definitely feel this pace, right, of communication, but also of language, of stability, spirituality, and freedom, not only for men, but also for women, right, for the Eastern Stars women.
I would completely agree with that. And if you take it back a generation or two generations before Schomburg, African American Freemasonry is largely spread by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, because the founder of it, Bishop Richard Allen, right, is one of the earliest. He helps get the movement started in Pennsylvania, and slowly but surely, that becomes a mode not only of communicating the Masonic movement, but also for ministers who are in the AME Church. It becomes very fashionable to not only be a Mason, but to become to be in a position where you can establish churches as an elder and lodges, because now you're either the grand lecturer or district deputy grand master or something. And I know that firsthand, because on one of my mother's lines, I have a 3 times great grandfather who was one of those ministers, right? Wow. So a lot of the lodges are being spread. As soon as you see an AME church pop up, if you're studying the origins of a Black community, whether it's in New Orleans, like you just said, or elsewhere, and New Orleans is a perfect example. Just real quick, 5 seconds. Reverend Thomas Springer goes down there to establish St. James AME Church, and the next thing you know, you've got a lodge popping up at the same exact time, same exact people. So that interplay that interplay is already there in the African American thrust. Schomburg is also coming from Puerto Rico, where it exists there too, and so even though he may have came here speaking Spanish, the moment he starts getting involved with Masonry and everything, certain things start clicking.
Yes. And even, I mean, and even Esther mentioned that many Creole, particularly like local Creole lodges, were prohibited during colonial times in Puerto Rico. And that's true, right? But even during this prohibition, I mean, which ends around the 1870s, many of these men were also spiritualists. So they will go to seances, to spiritual seances, for example. So the language of spirituality and the Masonic Lodge and also the Catholic Church were completely intertwined in places such as Mayagüez and Ponce, I mean, which were the sites, right, where local Creole Freemasonry started in Puerto Rico, right, in the western and southwestern sides of the island. So Mayagüez is key, right? As a town, is kind of like the center of Puerto Rican Freemasonry. So to study Freemasons in Puerto Rico, San Juan was important, but Mayagüez is actually the site.
Era el centro hegemónico, correcto.
Yes.
And we also
you had made a point of that where we had to tech.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to recognize that when the first Federación Espiritista comes into like existence, the places that they were being housed at, right? The places where they went and they were able to hold their sesiones espiritista were Masonic temples. The Freemasons were the ones that gave them the ability to congregate, right, and come together as espiritistas. Also noting that in late 1800s, early 1900s, Espiritismo was a belief system of not only the poor folks of the island and of the world, but of the upper class citizens, right? And so you have a lot of those folks coming together with the poor folks who are also Freemasons. They were also part of these Espiritista congregations. But we have to also think about San Domingue, which later becomes Haiti, and the influence of Saint Domingue and Jamaica on the higher degrees of Freemasonry, and how they enter through New Orleans. And then you put all that together and you see the heavy influences of African belief systems, like primarily Vodun and like Palo, where you see Masonic, and only someone who's a Freemason and practices those other practices will see there are very strong correlations and very strong, like some of the ceremonies are identical. And you ask yourself, well, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did Freemasonry bring in a lot of these African belief systems into their practices? I mean, let's just look at Baon Samedi from Vodun. Baon Samedi is the grand master of Vodun. All right, he is dressed as the worshipful master of a lodge. He is wearing the tuxedo with the tails, right? The coat and tails, the tuxedo, the white shirt, the white gloves, the top hat, and in a lot of the older depictions of Baon Samedi, Baon Semitiens, and a lot of these Guedes, right, from the Vodun rite, you will see him also wearing an apron, a Masonic apron, right? And then apart from that, within Palo Mayombe, within Vodun, there is the square and compass that continuously appears, and not just the square and compass, right? The square and compass, but also some of them with a star in the center, some of them with the G in the center. So you see Masonic images popping up in the graphic writing systems of the Bakongo and of the Dahomian nations in the Americas. And then add to that in Vodun itself, there's something that's called Rite Mason, which is the Masonic rites within Vodun. And they have lois that are representatives of like the different oficios de la logia, ¿verdad? Of the different lodge positions and offices that are being held of the lodge. And these lois are now the representatives of these different positions. So I mean, there's a heavy African presence within Freemasonry, especially within older Prince Hall Freemasonry and the Freemasonry that was coming from the Caribbean, particularly Puerto Rico, Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica.
So it is well known that these origins are from San Domingue and also from the Dominican Republic. This is why the western coast of Puerto Rico gets all these immigrants. And many of these lodges are founded by former Dominican or Haitian elders, right?
So one of the things that I found in Cuba, right, when I was doing my research on the Lucumí tradition, was that many of the Oluos wore the ring of the Masons. And when I asked some, they admitted to being part of the Masons and also Oluos. And going to Nancy's point, right, in terms of work, right, and the connection between work and being part of these lodges, they were all como trabajadores de muelle. They worked the docks. So is there history in terms of what Masons at that time were gravitating to in terms of not only work, but the notion of liberty, freedom, independence?
Yes. So, and when you talk about the first of all, if we go back even to the origins of Freemasonry itself and what it claims to be, Masonry in a certain vein claims to be descended from the craft guilds of the operative stonemasons, right? And so that right there, in and of itself, that's a whole conversation, right? Even the craft that the ritual and everything is really supposed to be based off of stonemasons trade. And if you go over to Scotland and Ireland up that way, there's still Masonic lodges that myself and my brother Alex, that we would not necessarily, we could visit, but we're not able to join unless we are actually in the building trades, right? If you're not in the building trades, you can visit, but they won't even let you become a member, right?
Okay.
Now to get more direct to your question, as far as on this side of the water and dealing with our folks, you will find Masons involved in all type of trades and whatnot. So I don't think that necessarily you'll find just one particular thing, but you'll find them spread throughout. And then when you start getting into the particulars, particularly outside of the ministry or education, we start getting into the barber's trade, when you start getting into the undertakers, which I'm actually doing some work on. I'm going to give a shout out to Dr. Cami Fletcher and my fellow research assistants. We're doing some work on researching Black funeral home directors right now with George Washington University. You'll find them all throughout. And when you do, oftentimes what I think you will find is that having that network within the network, those circles within circles that we kind of talk about within the lodge, right? You will start to find very quickly, you'll start saying, well, wait a minute, why is it that on Monday, Alex LaSalle is in charge and he's got James Morgan with him, and then Ebenezer is here, and then this one is here, and it's those same 5 people establishing a business, or they're working together some type of a way, and then they're moving over here, and then, oh, by the way, they're writing for the newspaper together. Oh, wait, these guys are all in the same lodge, or their lodges are within some proximity or under the same grant. They have some type of association that in many ways is invisible to the outside world, to the uninitiated, right? But if you know, then you really know, and then you start to say, well, oh, now I'm seeing the connection, right? I mean, I'm doing some work right now in my program at Morgan State. I'm writing about the Prince Hall Masonry during the Reconstruction period. One of the first things I'm going to talk about is the fact that the first 2 African American congressmen, they were members of 2 different lodges that met in the same building. Is that a coincidence or not? I mean, just thinking about that on a practical level, right? You'll find that over and over again. And overall, and I'll just say this as my last point. I think that especially at that time in New York, when you're looking at who's joining the lodges, particularly with Schomburg, they're thinking about, how do we stop the exploitation of Black labor, which has been going on at this point for generations? How do we slow it down, stop, and then reverse it? That is a part and parcel of the world, particularly the Masonic world that Schomburg would have been a part of. They're right in there, and they're also not just doing it in their time, but they are also, Schomburg in particular, is looking back. And what I mean by that is they're looking back not at their ancestors, whether you talk about from a racial sense, but also from a Masonic sense, and saying, well, wait a minute, Martin Delaney wasn't taking this, Prince Hall wasn't taking this, David Walker wasn't taking, and so Schomburg uses that as his thrust, particularly within the Masonic world, as a platform to stand on, and he uses that as his point of departure.
So we're soon coming to a close. So I'm going to do a round robin piece and ask each of you to make your last comments in terms of where do we go from here. Like Ebenezer says, there's more work to be done. And from your perspective, what work will you be taking on or instigating or motivating in others, yourself and others? So Nancy, let's start with you.
Yeah, I was worried about that I'd be the first one, because first of all, I just want to say this has been an amazing conversation, and I am so thankful to everyone for sharing their knowledge. It has been just brilliant. I've learned so much, and I've spent the bulk of my career on this, and to know that I can keep learning and learning is just really amazing. So thank you. I think that just like the Freemasonry is these connections, and James just brought something up for me. You are absolutely right. When you do research, it is the same 5 people talking to each other and the same 6 people. And you're sitting there going like, why, you know, I even thought, why is Garnett talking to Scotterin? I don't understand. And why is, you know, Serra talking to this person and Sotero Figueroa? And then you realize, and there's a great book called Figuras y Figurita by Teófilo Domínguez, and I wonder if Domínguez is also possibly a Freemason, because it's a book of like 6 or 7, I think 9 Afro-Cuban men, and it's published in 1899, and I argued that it is a text that is working against its own forgetting. It's saying our history is going to be forgotten, so we're going to write this book with images and our histories in 1899, which is a pivotal year because that is when the US intervenes in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and to say we're going to create this document. But as both James and Alex were talking, I wonder to what extent would that also a project of Freemasonry as well, right? So it is something to think about. I think that what I would like to see more work done, especially in the field of history, is several things. I think women, I think it's more, you know, really important to begin to look at the work. I did as much research that I could on Black women and their role and their work. I think more of Caribbean communities, West Indians, Jamaican, that is key to this history, especially the early history. Even in my research, there were Dominicans who were coming in the early 19th century that we know so little history of. And also culture, more on religion, more on what impact that had on the early communities. So that's what I would love to see. And I think Schomburg, his work really allows us to even ask those questions. So always so thankful to Schomburg.
Mari?
Apago el micrófono porque los aviones aquí son muchos, así que para que no escuchen tanto. Bueno, yo creo que el compromiso de llevar el legado de Schomburg, seguirlo fortaleciendo, seguir trabajando desde los espacios de las comunidades, que la gente, que los niños, que las mujeres, que todo el mundo pueda tener un espacio de discusión y de análisis. Las ideas de Benecer siempre me conectan el alma. Ahorita, esta mañana, estaba yo hablando con Malcolm, que es un artista, Malcolm Ferrer, y a mí me encanta cómo Malcolm dice las cosas y dice, vamos a meterle, tú sabes. Entonces estábamos hablando de la necesidad de hacer un lugar, una biblioteca y un espacio que cuente las historias nuestras, que estén nuestros libros, que estén nuestras autoras y nuestros autores, y los niños y las niñas se pueden enriquecer con esa información. Así que es como que esa conexión que está ahí, que siempre estamos mirando, que es importante construir esos espacios, que el sistema no los va a construir para nosotros, que no lo vamos a encontrar en las escuelas, no se está hablando de estas historias nuestras. Y yo creo que es importante seguir y no caer en la complicidad de no hacer nada, sino construir esos espacios y dar a conocer la historia y las aportaciones de nuestra gente.
Bueno, ya que Mari te llamó, Benecer.
Bueno, la verdad es que este compartir es bien importante porque nos permite pues, otra frontera en términos de la presencia de Arturo Alfonso Schomburg y traerlo a nuestro tiempo. ¿Qué podemos hacer con lo que tenemos sin quejarnos de lo que no tenemos? Así que yo creo que la tarea está ahí, el entusiasmo es patente y creo que debemos vernos más a menudo, ya sea por la vía no personal o ya sea personal, debemos verlo más a menudo y continuar hilando formas de que Puerto Rico confirme su identidad negra y confirme el valor de seres humanos como Arturo Alfonso Schomburg y otros que nos han dado tanto. Así que me parece que esta es una ocasión especial que estamos disfrutando.
Alex. some final tips and words?
I mean, just honestly, first of all, thank you all. You guys were amazing. Everyone in this panel was superb. But my thing is remembering that Freemasonry is not so much secret, right? But more so private. It's not like I don't go around saying I'm not a Freemason, or it's just that the ceremonies that are held within Lodge are private to us. It's a part of our. But what we do, it's an organization that's always been at the forefront of a lot of philanthropic endeavors, where the whole point is to help out and to help out those less fortunate, correct? But also to build up the members in a way where we are actually functioning within our communities and our societies in a way that's very positive. And so, you know, given all this, my whole thing has always been like the study of African culture, African traditions within the Americas, and it goes hand in hand with what Freemasonry is right now, right, and what it's been doing. Particularly so with, especially, you know, with the Prince Hall lodges, because I'm part of the Grand Lodge of New York, very proud member, but there are a lot of things of past, you know, the past. There are a lot of Freemason brothers that are hailed as amazing heroes, but they were slave owners. That they were, you know, these are some of the ugly things that a lot of Freemasons do not like to talk about. So I think it's important that we kind of start opening up and talking about this and looking at the certain hypocrisies, certain things that are found within our own structures as well as Freemasons, you know, in order to make more change so that we can have more of an influence in our communities, in our societies, and something that nowadays, as this is my personal opinion, but I feel that that there are very few spaces right now, very few positive spaces for Black and brown boys where they can really receive the education, the training, and the tools to become amazing men, right? Where they can become upright, upstanding men, where we kind of start chopping down machismo, start chopping down a lot of, like, you know, toxic masculinity that's found within our communities, you know, right now. And I think that a lot of these spaces are perfect spots for that. Like Freemasonry is just that for me as well, and for my community, and I know in our lodge, I belong to a very interesting lodge because we're a lodge of musicians and artists. We're a daytime lodge too. We don't meet at night because of the fact that, you know, that our lodge, you know, I belong to St. Cecilia Lodge number 568, right? And St. Cecilia Lodge, the reason being is because we work at night.
Yeah, exactly.
Musicians, as artists, as and in part of my lodge, I mean, there's babalaos, there's folks that are abacua, there are folks that practice Vodun, Espiritismo, Palo, they're Catholics, they're you know, Protestants. There's all types of people in my lodge, and so we bring these teachings to our communities, and yet we find ourselves as one family, right? As one brotherhood. So it's just something to take away from this.
Déjame comentar algo cuando el compañero termine. Hola.
Sí, ya terminamos.
Estamos. Ajá.
Okay. Sí, quería comentar, Marta, que en Puerto Rico las logias masónicas no se han identificado con Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Que yo recuerde, en el 2007 yo tuve el privilegio de hacer la primera conferencia que se dio sobre Schomburg en la Gran Logia Soberana, porque había unos cuantas personas que tenían interés en el tema y pues, fuimos allí, montamos la conferencia, lleno el salón, pero un desconocimiento total entre los masones, total. Y me dio todavía mayor contradicción porque como 8 o 10 años antes, en la logia Orfélica de Carolina, que no tiene el nombre que tiene la gran logia masónica, yo con otras personas instauramos una conferencia anual sobre Arturo Schomburg. Y invitábamos ahí a la gente de renombre y los que no tenían nombre, y se juntaba el grupo y se disfrutaba mucho de la presencia de esa figura en un templo férico, conversando sobre una persona que no era fero, era masón, pero se le daba un reconocimiento. Y eso prácticamente se perdió. Yo creo que es importante que los hermanos y hermanas amazones que tienen hermanos y hermanas conocidos en Puerto Rico, los inviten y los insten a tomar por lo menos 1 o 2 actividades al año en relación a Arturo Alfonso Schomburg y su rol en la masonería. Y de ahí podemos derivar a otros temas. Pero me parece que es un campo que se ha quedado desierto. De hecho, hay templos que están abandonados, que con un poco de esfuerzo quizás se pueden rehabilitar y convertirlos en pequeñas bibliotecas o bibliotecas comunitarias, donde la figura central sea Arturo Alfonso Schomburg y su activismo por los derechos humanos y por la educación y por la puertorriqueñidad y por todo lo bueno que él nos legó. Así que yo creo que hay mucho que hacer y todos podemos hacer un poquito.
Gracias.
Bueno, yo tuve la oportunidad, I had the chance to present my book in 2018 in the Great Lodge, La Gran Logia Soberana. And it was really an incredible experience because the presentation was kind of like done as a Masonic meeting. So they were standing up and sitting down. It was really an incredible moment for me because of my Masonic ancestors, first of all, but second of all, because I was with another woman, Marta Ponte, who was presenting the book.
Marta
Ponte Encina, who happens to be a Puerto Rican writer, a Puerto Rican critic. So it was kind of like really an amazing experience. The brother who organized everything, he passed away 2 days ago. El brother Miguel Pereira. So the Great Lodge has lost a really important member, and he was also a historian. And he published a lot of texts of Masonic knowledge in Puerto Rico. So just to mention that he passed recently, and he will be dearly missed. But I agree, all of this in relation to Schomburg, but also teaching Schomburg in schools, I think is a priority in Puerto Rico, everywhere. Our students, as Maricruz was saying, they don't know about Schomburg. They don't know his story, and they're not able to read his work. Not only pedagogical books, books for children, but just his writings made them accessible, and being able to teach them, I think is central, is important.
James, do you have closing words?
Yeah. Well, first of all, again, thank you all so much. I am thrilled to have been here and to meet, and in some cases re-meet some of you. I have to say to Brother LaSalle, we're gonna hook up. So you see, Nancy mentioned earlier, keep seeing those 5 and 6 people together. Nancy gonna look up one day. She's gonna see a picture of me and Alex. We're gonna have our aprons on. We're gonna be drumming. We're gonna have a good time.
Yes, you better believe that.
Exactly. We're gonna be working it out. We're gonna be working out. But this time, you'll know why. But this has been a thrill. As far as next steps, I agree with everything that's been said. I think we do have to teach Schomburg, as well as the others that have been mentioned here tonight, those both widely known and those lesser known. We have to keep teaching them, but we also have to live and continue to carry those torches on. Schomburg was not just an aloof scholar somewhere in a room with some books in a notebook writing stuff down. He's also an activist. He's also a member and a leader in these organizations. He's a political thinker, but he's also a man who joins and also establishes institutions that have long outlived him. Okay, like Dr. John Clark once said, we have to learn how to bury the man, continue the plan, right? And so the Schomburg Center that exists now stands as a testimonial. And I think we went through this whole thing. I don't think we even mentioned really the center, but we have to continue these institutions and the institutional work of great men and women like Schomburg. We have to continue to read and study them. And regardless of where you find yourself, see, it's one thing for us, for those of us who are in this who are Masons, let's say, it's one thing to be in the same organization, but you're not about the work. We have to really be about the work and walk in those same spiritual steps. I mean, for me, in 2019, when I became the actual grand historian for Washington, D.C., and even before that, when I was an assistant back in 2014, when I was assistant grand historian, I understood that when I put that collar and apron on, that I wasn't putting a collar and apron on to be like George Washington and some of these other individuals that Brother LaSalle talked about who were slave owners and other things. I was putting that collar and apron on to try to be like Schomburg, to try to be like some of the other individuals that we've talked about tonight. And so it's in their names and their footsteps that I walk, and I know that you all are walking. And I think the last thing I'll just say is that we need to continue to walk together, because the only way we came over here together, only way we're gonna get free is by being together, regardless of regardless of what stop the boat let you off at. We're gonna have to be together. And I wish I could say it in Spanish and French and Portuguese, but somebody out there will translate it for me. The only way we're gonna get out of this thing is together. And I'm glad to see that we did that tonight.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for accepting the invitation. Thank you, Josanna,
for making the initiative and making this possible. Thank you.
And I think that in framing the panel, the idea was to bring people who were working with the same objective from different perspectives and different work. And I think that what we're saying is that, in fact, an educational system, right, that uses the framework that Arturo Schomburg brought together is the framework that we have to start instituting. Because a lot of people say education, but miseducation is also education, right? And we've all gone through it. So that we're developing a structure that brings information from different perspectives as valued, right? And that our communities are monuments, and we have to preserve them and make sure that they are protected. And that as we see young people developing, that they understand that hierarchy is not necessarily the way, but community and social connections are the way if we're going to be free. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Gracias. Thank you, James.
Thank you all. And we'll do this again.
For those who understand, what may it be?
Bye.